You walk through the halls of a medieval castle in southwestern Poland. Above you are stone towers, grand rooms, carved staircases, and the remains of aristocratic Europe. But beneath your feet, hidden inside the mountain itself, the Nazis carved something very different. Raw tunnels, concrete chambers, underground passages whose full purpose historians still cannot prove with certainty. This is Książ Castle. During the war, it was confiscated by the Reich and altered by Organization Todt between 1943 and 1945. Below it, tunnels were driven into the earth, and in the surrounding Owl Mountains, an even larger project was underway. Its name was Riese, the Giant. Riese was real. It had camps, it had prisoners, it had underground construction, it had thousands of deaths. But the surviving documents do not fully explain what the entire complex was meant to become. And Książ was only the doorway. Because across Nazi Germany, annexed Austria, occupied Poland, and occupied France, the Third Reich was digging into mountains, forests, cliffs, quarries, and concrete. Not because it was winning, but because it was losing the air war. Inside mountains, prisoners assembled rockets. Inside tunnels, jet fighter parts were produced. Inside chalk cliffs, engineers planned a cannon aimed at London. Inside one colossal bunker, the German Navy tried to build submarines protected from bombs. Some of these sites worked, some failed, some were abandoned, some are still physically accessible today, and some survived long after the regime that built them collapsed. This was not one hidden Nazi underground empire. It was something stranger, a fragmented, desperate, late-war underground war machine. And the deeper you go, the clearer one thing becomes. The mystery is not only what remains unknown, it is what is already documented. By 1943, the skies above Germany had changed. Allied bombing was tearing into German industry. Aircraft factories, rocket facilities, shipyards, and weapons production sites were becoming increasingly vulnerable. The regime's answer was not elegant. It was not one grand master plan. It was a pattern. Move underground, move into mountains, move into tunnels, move behind concrete, move anything critical where bombs might not reach it. The most accurate way to understand this world is not as a single secret underground empire. It was a patchwork. Different sites were run by different combinations of the SS, Organization Todt, the German Navy, the Army Weapons Office, Reich ministries, and private contractors. But they were linked by the same pressure. The war above ground was becoming impossible to hide. So the Reich began forcing its war economy beneath Europe. In August 1943, after the Allied raid on Peenemünde, the first Dora prisoners were sent to the Konstein tunnels near Nordhausen only 10 days later. That speed matters. It shows how reactive the underground shift was. This was not calm long-term planning. This was emergency relocation under bombardment. In Austria, tunnel drives began around Gusen and Ebensee. In Bremen-Farge, the Navy pushed ahead with a massive protected submarine assembly bunker. In Upper Bavaria, the fighter program planned semi-buried bunkers for Me-262 production. In occupied France, Mimoyecques was carved into the chalk as a base for the V3 cannon, and in Lower Silesia, Project Riese expanded beneath mountains and beneath Książ Castle. But there was one fact that connected almost every major site. The underground world was built by people who had no choice. Concentration camp prisoners, prisoners of war, civilian forced laborers, military internees. Thousands entered these construction systems, thousands died in them. This is the contradiction at the center of the story. The structures can look like engineering marvels, but they were also instruments of coercion, exhaustion, and death. The tunnels were not just hidden spaces, they were crime scenes beneath the landscape. And nowhere does the mixture of mystery, scale, and missing evidence become more visible than in the forests of Lower Silesia. In the Owl Mountains, tunnel entrances disappear into the hillside. Some are cut into rock, some open into damp corridors, some lead to unfinished chambers where concrete, stone, and darkness seem to stop mid-sentence. This was Project Riese, the Giant. Work probably began in October 1943. The Gross-Rosen Museum describes A.L. Riese as a system of 13 camps plus a camp hospital tied to construction in the Owl Mountains and at Książ, then called Fürstenstein. Around 13,000 prisoners passed through the Riese camp system. An estimated 5,000 died. But the reason Riese still pulls historians, filmmakers, and visitors back is not only its scale, it is the missing answer. What was the whole complex for? Project Riese was real. It was unfinished. It involved forced labor. It was connected to major underground construction in Lower Silesia. Its full intended overall function cannot be defined with confidence because documentation is incomplete. Książ Castle was likely being adapted for an important headquarters or Führer residence function within the wider Riese undertaking. At least some of the Owl Mountains tunnel systems were likely intended for protected industrial or mixed military use. But stories of a vast underground city, secret highways, treasure vaults, werewolf labs, Nazi UFOs, occult chambers, or supernatural final redoubts are not established by the surviving evidence. The important point is not that anything can be imagined because records are missing. The important point is that enough survives to prove something enormous was attempted, and enough is missing to prevent a final answer. Książ gives the project its most cinematic image: a castle above, a bunker-like tunnel world below. The castle's own history says it was probably being adapted as quarters for Hitler, while also acknowledging that the full purpose of the underground works remains unresolved. That tension is why Książ works as the doorway into the film. It is real enough to document, unfinished enough to question, and strange enough to remember. But Riese was not a functioning underground war economy in the way other sites became. It remained incomplete. Its purpose remains debated. Its ruins became a magnet for myth precisely because the archive has gaps, and those gaps matter. Because in another mountain, the record is clearer. There, the underground world was no longer a mystery project. It was an operational weapons factory. Near Nordhausen in central Germany, the Kohnstein Massif already contained tunnels. After the Allied raid on Peenemünde, those tunnels became one of the most important underground weapons sites of the war. This was Mittelwerk. And the camp system around it became Dora-Mittelbau. The shift happened fast. 10 days after the Peenemünde attack, the first 107 prisoners arrived at Dora. Their task was to expand the tunnels for V2 production. The V2 was one of the regime's priority weapons, but the place where it was assembled became one of the clearest examples of the real underground war. The detail that makes Dora so disturbing is this: prisoners did not only work underground, at first they slept there, inside the tunnels, in improvised bunks, under catastrophic hygienic conditions. Many thousands died in the first months. This is where the idea of underground production stops being abstract. It was not just concrete and machinery, it was an entire forced world below the mountain. Work, sleep, exhaustion, death. All inside the same buried system. From August 1944, former sleeping tunnels were repurposed for V-1 cruise missile production as well. The underground system evolved. Spaces that had held prisoners were folded into production. The human being was moved out only when the machinery needed more room. Dora-Mittelbau reached significant production. Prisoners assembled missiles underground. Prisoners initially slept inside the tunnel system in catastrophic conditions. Former sleeping tunnels later became part of V-1 production. Another fact makes the site even darker. Mittelbau prisoners formed resistance efforts aimed at slowing or sabotaging production. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum states that more than 200 were publicly hanged for sabotage. Dora was not a myth. It was not a rumor. It was a functioning underground armament site built on extreme coercion, and after the war, the tunnel system was sealed by Soviet authorities. Only decades later was part of it reopened for memorial tours. Today, parts of the historic tunnel system can be visited. That matters because it collapses the distance between past and present. The viewer is not looking at a vanished legend. They are looking at a physical place that still exists. Dora gives the story its early payoff. Yes, the Nazis really did move weapons production underground. Yes, it happened inside mountains. Yes, prisoners were forced to build and operate it. But Dora was only one part of the underground shift. Because hundreds of miles away, another tunnel project was being driven into Austrian ground. And this one was tied to the aircraft the Reich hoped could change the air war. Near St. Georgen and Ergusen in annexed Austria, the ground was opened for a project with a deceptively beautiful name: Bergkristall, rock crystal. Its code was B8. Its purpose was not beautiful. It was a major tunnel project of the German wartime economy, launched in 1944 to create bomb-proof facilities for Messerschmitt fighter production, especially the Me-262. The Me-262 was one of the most advanced aircraft Germany produced. But by 1944, factories above ground were increasingly exposed. So the regime did what it was doing elsewhere. It pushed production into protected space. At Bergkristall, up to 6,000 prisoners worked on the site at a time. Production of fuselages and parts began as early as autumn 1944. By the end of the war, around 8 kilometers of tunnels had been excavated, amounting to roughly 50,000 square meters of underground area. This is the scale reveal. Bergkristall was not just a hole in a mountain, it became a real underground production environment. Bergkristall reached mass production in late 1944. It was linked to Messerschmitt fighter production, especially the Me-262. By war's end, it contained around 8 kilometers of tunnels and roughly 50,000 square meters of underground area. But every scale graphic needs its shadow. Gusen II was expanded to house the labor force for Bergkristall. At least 8,600 prisoners were murdered there or died from conditions. This is where the engineering story must not become detached from the human one. The same tunnels that can be animated as impressive underground infrastructure were created through a system that consumed people. The same production that makes the site historically important also makes it morally unbearable. The SS Sonderstab Kammler supervised the Bergkristall project from March 1944. By autumn, it was producing. That speed tells the same story as Dora. The underground war was not careful. It was forced, accelerated, improvised under pressure, and deadly. Today, the Bergkristall tunnels remain part of the memorial landscape. There is guided access and ongoing memorial development around the tunnel entrances. The site survived. But what it represents is not simply hidden technology. It is the moment the Reich tried to bury modern aircraft production beneath the earth and used prisoners to make the impossible timetable real. And while Bergkristall produced aircraft parts, another project in northern Germany reached a scale so enormous that even today it looks almost unreal. A bunker built to manufacture submarines. A bunker where no submarine was ever completed. At Bremenfarge, near the Weser, stands one of the most massive surviving structures of the underground war, Bunker Valentin. Strictly speaking, it was not underground in the same way as Dora or Bergkristall. It was a colossal above-ground bunker, but it belongs to the same story because it was part of the same shift into protected armament space. The German Navy wanted a bomb-proof submarine assembly site. Open shipyards had become too vulnerable under Allied air superiority. Valentin was designed for assembly line construction of submarines, especially using prefabricated sections. The structure was 426 meters long, 97 meters wide, and up to 33 meters high. Inside, prefabricated U-boat sections were supposed to be welded and equipped, protected by concrete, hidden not by being under a mountain, but by being almost impossible to destroy from above. But the project reveals one of the central contradictions of late-war Nazi engineering. The scale was enormous. The ambition was enormous. But the war was moving faster than the concrete could harden. Up to 10,000 forced laborers worked there. The memorial estimates around 1,600 died. Bunker Valentin was intended as a massive U-boat shipyard. It was 426 meters long, 97 meters wide, and up to 33 meters high. Up to 10,000 forced laborers worked there. Around 1,600 died, according to the memorial. No submarine was ever built. There, in late March 1945, an RAF strike damaged an unfinished part of the bunker. Construction stopped. The protected shipyard had not produced the weapons it was built for. There is something almost absurd in that fact. A bunker so large it survived the regime. A shipyard so protected it outlasted the war. A project so late that it never completed a submarine. After the war, Valentin did not disappear. It later served as a Bundesmarine depot. Since 2011, it has functioned as a memorial. The structure outlived its purpose by decades. And that is what makes it visually powerful. It is not a ruin in the romantic sense. It is a surviving object of industrial desperation. Valentin shows the underground turn at its most massive, but another site shows it at its most bizarre. Not a submarine factory, not an aircraft tunnel. A hidden fortress in France built around a weapon meant to fire on London from across the Channel. In the chalk landscape of occupied France, near Mimoyecques, the Nazis carved galleries into the earth for one of the strangest weapons projects of the war, the V3, a multi-charge cannon aimed at London. The official memorial states that more than 1,000 laborers of various origins built the site from June 1943 to July 1944. The plan was extreme. Galleries connected 5 firing shafts. Each shaft was to hold 5 guns. The planned bombardment rate was 1,500 shells a day. The original program even envisioned 2 identical bunkers for 3,000 shells per day. This is one of the strongest technical reveals in the film, not because the weapon succeeded, because the planned scale was so extreme. A hidden underground artillery site, built into France, aimed at London, designed around industrialized bombardment. Mimoyecques was a secret underground base intended for the V3 cannon. It was aimed at London. The planned rate was 1,500 shells per day, with a larger program envisioning 3,000. It never delivered operational bombardment as planned. On July 6, 1944, RAF Tallboy strikes reached the heart of the fortress. After that, the site was abandoned before Canadian troops arrived in September. It was later dynamited in May 1945. Today, it is a museum and memorial site. Mimoyecques is important because it widens the underground world. This was not only about protecting production, it was also about hiding retaliation weapons. Factories went underground, rockets went underground, aircraft parts went underground, and even a giant cannon aimed at a capital city was buried into the landscape. But the deeper the war went, the more the underground projects began to look like a race against reality. The next site was supposed to help produce jet fighters at a scale the collapsing Reich could no longer realistically support. In Upper Bavaria at Mühldorfer Hart, the Reich planned another protected aircraft production site, codename Weingut I, Vineyard 1. The Mühldorf study explains the logic. Allied bombing forced aircraft production to disperse. Then the Reich tried to reconcentrate it in specially built, half-submerged bunkers. After the Normandy invasion, the plan narrowed to 2 sites, including Mühldorf. The finished bunker was expected to contribute to Me-262 production. Under the fighter program, the completed Mühldorf facility was supposed to help produce over 900 Me-262s per month. That number is the hook, because by this stage of the war, the gap between ambition and reality was widening every week. Organization TOT ran the project. The majority of roughly 10,000 laborers were prisoners of war and Dachau concentration camp prisoners. Weingut I was a late-war Me-262 bunker project. The majority of roughly 10,000 laborers were POWs and Dachau concentration camp prisoners. Only 7 of 12 planned arches had been completed by late April 1945. The bunker itself had never been bombed. American troops occupied the site in May 1945. In 1947, 120 tons of TNT were used to collapse the structure. The construction method is ideal for animation. Show a barrel vault bunker, show gravel arch supports, show the concrete shell, show service tunnels and internal levels, then stop the animation halfway. Because that is how the project ended, incomplete. There are also details in the Mühldorf study that reveal the bureaucracy behind the desperation. There was no formal contract awarded to Polensky and Zollner, even though the company later billed organization TOT for more than 25 million Reichsmarks. Camp inmates were nominally paid, but never actually received the money. Weingut I is not the most famous site, but it may be one of the clearest symbols of late-war contradiction. A giant protected aircraft facility designed for enormous output, built by forced labor, never completed, never bombed, then deliberately collapsed after the war. In the underground war, failure did not mean harmlessness. Even projects that never produced weapons still consumed lives. And that leads to one of the darkest sites in the story. A tunnel system whose purpose changed. A camp where more than 8,100 prisoners died. And a final plan that, if carried out, would have turned the tunnels into a mass grave. In annexed Austria, at Ebensee, prisoners excavated 2 tunnel systems totaling 40,000 square meters. The original purpose was tied to the safe relocation of the Army Weapons Office's Peenemünde rocket research operation. But in the end, the tunnels were used to produce fuel and engine components for Steyr-Daimler-Puch. This is one of the strongest examples of how the underground war changed under pressure. Plans shifted, priorities changed, the tunnels remained, the prisoners kept digging. Around 27,000 prisoners passed through Ebensee. More than 8,100 died. Ebensee was originally intended as an air raid safe location for Peenemünde-related rocket research. The tunnels ended up producing fuel and engine components instead. Prisoners excavated 2 tunnel systems totaling 40,000 square meters. Around 27,000 prisoners passed through Ebensee. More than 8,100 died. Then, shortly before liberation, camp authorities planned to kill the inmates by blowing them up inside the tunnels. The prisoners thwarted the plan. This is the final moral descent of the documentary. Because by the end, the underground system was not only about protecting weapons from bombs. It was about what the regime was prepared to do with the people it had forced below ground. At Dora, prisoners slept and worked in tunnels. At Bergkristall, thousands died around aircraft production. At Valentin, forced labor built a bunker that never produced a submarine. At Weingut I, men built arches for a future that never arrived. At Ebensee, the tunnels almost became the place where prisoners would be murdered before liberation. The deeper this story goes, the less it feels like a mystery about hidden bunkers. It becomes a story about a regime trying to bury its war economy, its weapons, and its crimes beneath Europe. But not everything stayed buried. return now to Książ, to the castle above, to the tunnels below, to the incomplete record. At the beginning, Riese looked like the central mystery. What was the giant meant to become? A headquarters? A protected industrial complex? A mixed military project? Something connected to Hitler's command infrastructure? The honest answer is limited. Riese existed. It was unfinished. It used a system of camps tied to Gross Rosen. Around 13,000 prisoners passed through A.L. Riese, and an estimated 5,000 died. The complete intended function cannot be proven with confidence from surviving documentation. Książ Castle was likely being adapted for an important headquarters or Führer residence function within the wider project. The wilder stories are not established by evidence. This is where the film must be clear. The absence of a complete blueprint does not prove a fantasy, but it does prove something else. The Nazis built enough underground infrastructure across Europe that rumors did not have to invent the darkness. The darkness was already there. Dora shows the underground war working. Bergkristall shows aircraft production moving into tunnels. Valentin shows the scale of protected naval construction. Mimoyecques shows retaliation weapons buried into cliffs. Weingut I shows late war ambition collapsing into unfinished concrete. Ebensee shows how shifting priorities and forced labor ended in catastrophe. And Riese shows how missing records can leave a real project suspended between evidence and uncertainty. The most unsettling truth is not that historians still cannot answer every question. It is that the confirmed record already shows a continent-wide pattern of forced labor, industrial concealment, and desperation. This was not a seamless underground empire. It was rushed, fragmented, often unfinished, sometimes operational, frequently deadly, and built because the regime was running out of sky. Today, several of these sites can still be visited: Dora, Książ, parts of Riese, Bergkristall, Mimoyecques, Valentin, Ebensee. They survive as ruins, museums, memorials, and scars in the landscape. The tunnels survived, the bunkers survived, even parts of the factories survived. But many of the records did not. And that is why, 80 years later, historians are still trying to piece together what was built beneath Europe. Not because the underground world vanished, but because enough of it remains to remind us how much was hidden there in the first place.